The fluorescent lights hum above Oak Creek Memorial's ICU like a swarm of insects caught in glass. Sarah Chen moves through the night shift with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory, not intention, her hand steady as she checks the fall line on Bay 3, adjusts the ventilator settings on Bay 5, administers meds to the post-op patient in Bay 2 without once breaking the rhythm of her own breathing. The antiseptic smell of the unit is thick enough to coat your tongue, mixed with the faint metallic undertone of blood and saline. Her scrubs are plain blue, unremarkable. Her dark hair is pulled back tight. No one here knows that those steady hands once performed emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife under mortar fire in a place called Tikrit. Beneath her collar, hidden from the casual glance of colleagues and supervisors, hangs a single dog tag on a broken chain. She touches it once when she reaches the medication cart at 0247 hours, just her fingers brushing the outline through the fabric, a gesture so small it might have been a nervous tick if nervous was something Sarah Chen still experienced. The dog tag is engraved with a call sign she hasn't spoken aloud in 8 years and a date that tastes like copper when she remembers it. She lets her hand fall away. The movement takes less than 2 seconds. She walks with a measured pace through the ICU corridors, her left leg favoring a slight limp, not pronounced enough to draw questions, just enough that she knows it's there with every step. The limp is from a GSW that passed through her thigh in 2016. The entry wound scarred clean. The exit wound left a divot the size of a dime. She passes the nurse's station where Derek, the night resident, is scrolling through patient charts with the glazed expression of someone at hour 17 of a 24-hour shift. He doesn't look up. Sarah doesn't expect him to. She's been at Oak Creek for 4 years, and in those 4 years she's been promoted twice because of her work ethic and because patients recover faster under her care, and in those 4 years not a single colleague has asked her a personal question that required more than a 2-word answer. The ICU is a controlled environment. Machines keep the dying alive at intervals measured in minutes. The monitors beep in a rhythm that becomes white noise after a few hours. You stop hearing it and start feeling it, like a second heartbeat in your chest. Sarah knows this rhythm the way a musician knows a song they've played 10,000 times. She reads the monitors without looking at them. She knows when O2 saturation is dropping by the way the light changes in a patient's lips. She knows when blood pressure is bottoming out by the quality of the silence that follows the beep. These are not skills she lists on her resume. At 0301, a new patient arrives in Bay 7. The admit papers say motor vehicle accident, blunt force trauma to the chest, stable vitals, observation and wound care. The paramedics wheel in a male patient, early 30s, muscular, with the specific kind of tan line that comes from years in a desert climate and the specific kind of calluses on his hands that come from weapons handling. Sarah doesn't comment on these details. She watches the paramedics transfer him to the bed with practiced efficiency, watches them hand off to the resident on call, watches the monitors establish a baseline rhythm. His name according to the paperwork is Mitchell. No rank listed. No service branch. Just Mitchell, admitted via ER, reason for visit coded as trauma observation. She's charting post-op vitals on another patient when she notices something in Mitchell's admission paperwork. The medication list. Specifically, the supplier codes on 3 of the pharmaceutical orders that came in with his transport. She's only seen those codes once before, 8 years ago, on black market supply chains that funneled through military hospitals overseas. The codes indicate pharmaceutical sourcing from intermediaries that don't exist on any FDA registry. The codes indicate someone with access to classified military procurement channels is moving controlled substances through civilian hospitals. Sarah makes a note in her personal notepad, not the patient chart, just a small scratch of numbers on the bottom of a page in her jacket pocket. She has learned to document nothing that could be traced. She has learned to notice everything and say nothing. She has learned to look like a competent night shift nurse and think like a major, which are 2 different skill sets that should never be confused. At 0315, Dr. Ashford arrives for his rounds. He's been the attending physician in the ICU for 7 months, and in those 7 months he's developed the kind of reputation that comes from expensive suits and a family connection to the hospital board. His watch costs more than Sarah's monthly rent. His cologne arrives in the room before his body does. He moves through the ICU with the casual authority of someone who has never been questioned about his decisions, and he notices immediately that Sarah is examining Mitchell's chart with the intensity of someone reading a coded message. The observation is quick. A flicker in Ashford's expression, a calculation replacing courtesy, like a predator noticing movement in tall grass. He approaches the nurse's station where Sarah is standing. The fluorescent lights cast his shadow across the chart she's holding. She doesn't look up. She's been trained to never show that she's aware of being observed. But her right hand steadies on the edge of the counter, and her breathing adjusts to the subaudible level that comes from tactical awareness. Someone dangerous just entered her peripheral vision. That admission in Bay 7, Ashford says. His voice is measured, conversational, the kind of tone a doctor uses when asking about vitals. You examining his paperwork for a particular reason? Sarah closes the chart. She doesn't rush. She doesn't fumble. She moves with the unhurried precision that comes from 8 years of being invisible in rooms where people were dying. Standard medication reconciliation, she says. Her voice is steady. Deferential. The voice of someone who has learned that attention is dangerous. Wanted to make sure nothing was flagged for interactions. Of course. Ashford nods once. He's still looking at her with that expression, not anger, not yet. Just assessment. You have a background in pharmaceutical supply chain. High school chemistry, Sarah says. Which is true. It's also incomplete. High school chemistry, followed by a degree in emergency medical sciences from Johns Hopkins, followed by 8 years of classified medical training in field conditions that no civilian hospital would ever replicate. But you don't say these things. Just good practice. Indeed. He holds the moment for 2 seconds longer than necessary, then breaks his gaze. Keep an eye on his vitals. Chest trauma can present delayed complications. Yes, doctor. He walks away, his footsteps clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounds like a countdown. Sarah's left hand unclenches from the edge of the counter. Her heart rate remains steady. Around her neck, the dog tag shifts slightly as she takes a measured breath. Somewhere in the back of her mind, in a part of her brain that hasn't been deactivated in 8 years, alarm bells are ringing. But the night shift continues. Machines beep. Monitors glow. And Sarah Chen, who was once Major Sarah Chen, who once held a field hospital together for 16 hours with her own 2 hands while mortar rounds fell like rain, continues to move through the ICU with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to be ordinary in a way that only the extraordinary can manage. She checks vitals on Bay 2. Adjusts for flow on Bay 4. Documents the 0330 rounds without deviating a single detail from standard protocol. Her hands are steady. Her voice when she speaks to colleagues is soft. Her presence is so unremarkable that Derek doesn't even glance up from his computer as she passes the nurse's station at 0345. But in Bay 7, Mitchell's chest wound has begun to show the first signs of dehiscence. The sutures are intact, but there's tension gathering beneath the dressing that shouldn't be there. The kind of tension that comes before a rupture. And Ashford, moving with the calm authority of someone who has already planned his next move, is watching from the observation window with an expression that suggests he knows exactly what's about to happen. What she didn't know was that Ashford had already made a phone call at 0258 hours, before Mitchell even arrived. What she didn't know was that the medication codes she'd noticed were intentional, breadcrumbs left in plain sight for someone with her specific training to find. What she didn't know was that everything about Mitchell's arrival, everything about Ashford's sudden appearance, everything about the next 72 hours, had been orchestrated by forces operating far above the level of a night shift nurse. The clock was already running. The trap was already set. And Sarah, who had learned 8 years ago how to survive in impossible situations, was about to remember that some lessons never fade. The overhead page crackled at 1900 hours, cutting through the soft hum of ventilators and heart monitors. Nurse Chen, the Nightingale, to administration immediately. The nickname hung in the air like something physical. 2 residents smirked. A CNA whispered to her colleague, the word swallowed by the beep of an 4 pump, but Sarah heard them anyway. She always heard. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she set down her medication cart with the same measured precision she'd once used to pack a field medical kit under mortar fire. Her jaw tightened, a single muscle flexing beneath her skin, then released. Control. It was all about control now. She walked toward the elevator, passing nurses who suddenly found their charts fascinating, their eyes refusing to meet hers. The door slid open with a mechanical sigh. 3rd floor. Administration. The hallway stretched longer than it had 3 weeks ago, or maybe time just moved differently when you were being erased for the second time in your life. The first time had been official, government paperwork, classified stamps, a general shaking her hand while telling her to disappear. This time felt messier. This time felt like drowning in slow motion while everyone watched. Dr. Ashford was waiting in his office, but he wasn't there. Not really. He was already somewhere else, already 3 moves ahead like a chess player who'd studied your patterns. Sarah had seen that look before in intelligence briefer's eyes, the look of someone who'd found leverage and was about to use it. She turned from his desk and headed for the supply closet instead, her instinct pulling her toward the one place in this hospital where no one looked. Where no one went except for restocking runs at shift change. She was gathering replacement for bags when the door closed behind her. The hinges squeaked, a small sound, easy to miss, but her body registered it the way a predator registers a snapped twig. Ashford blocked the doorway, his white coat immaculate, his expression carrying the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. Not the calm that came from having survived anything. The other kind. The kind that came from having never risked anything at all. Your transfer to the county facility processes tomorrow, he said, his voice dropping to a precision whisper. Or I'll ensure your nursing license undergoes very thorough scrutiny. He stepped closer, and the air seemed to compress. There are gaps in your employment history, Sarah. Questions about your credentials. It would be unfortunate if the state board investigated. Very unfortunate. These things have a way of derailing entire careers. The supply closet was small, lined with boxes of gauze and saline bags stacked like ammunition. Sarah's hand stayed steady on the cart. Her breathing stayed steady. The part of her that remembered how to survive, the part that had held it together through an 18-hour siege in Tikrit with her hands inside another soldier's abdomen, keeping his liver from bleeding out, that part didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But one tear escaped anyway. Just one. Not from fear. Not from desperation. From the weight of it. The sheer exhaustion of living a lie, of pretending to be small when she was anything but, of letting men like this one take away her badge and her rank and her name and still smile at them while doing it. She didn't try to hide it. She wiped it away deliberately, slowly, without breaking eye contact, and said quietly, I've survived worse men than you pretending to be doctors. His expression flickered, something like confusion, quickly buried. She moved past him, her shoulder brushing his white coat, and the moment stretched thin as she waited for him to step aside. He did. Control again. He'd won this round in his mind, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the illusion of power was all a man like him needed. That evening at 18:45, Sarah pulled into the parking lot for her shift. The December air was sharp, carrying the salt smell of the coast even this far inland. Her scrubs were still damp from her shower, she'd driven home and back, needing the reset, needing to feel like herself for 20 minutes before returning to a place where she had to feel like nothing at all. The employee entrance was crowded. Shift change. For nurses arriving, 2 residents, the ICU charge nurse whose name was Morrison and who'd been kind to her once, 3 weeks ago, before the trap closed. Ashford stood near the glass doors like he'd been waiting. Maybe he had been. Maybe this was always part of it, the public peace, the visible destruction that made sure everyone knew not to stand near the falling person. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering administrative necessity. Effective immediately, Nurse Chen is reassigned to CNA duties. She'll be assisting with basic patient care under supervision. His eyes never left hers. Questions about her clinical judgment have been raised. The charge nurse went very still. A resident coughed. Sarah counted 3 seconds in her head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, then nodded once and walked past them into the hospital. Her ID badge felt like it weighed 50 pounds. The plastic pressed against her ribs, marking her as staff, marking her as nothing. That's what they saw. That's what they were supposed to see. A nurse who'd been caught doing something wrong, who'd been publicly demoted, who would slink into the background and eventually quit and disappear. They didn't know that she'd been demoted before. Different country, different century, different kind of war. They didn't know that she'd worn a uniform while men saluted her, that she'd made decisions that cost lives, that she'd lived with those decisions. They didn't know that public humiliation felt like a luxury compared to what she'd actually survived. The absence of choice. The weight of command. The blood that never quite washed out from under your fingernails no matter how hard you scrubbed. Sarah worked her CNA shift in silence, changing linens and recording vitals while her former colleagues found reasons to avoid her section of the ICU. A junior resident asked another nurse for help instead of calling her over. One of the nurses she'd trained actively looked away when Sarah passed her in the hallway. The isolation was precise, professional, and complete. This was the worst part, not the demotion, but the careful distance everyone suddenly maintained. Like failure was contagious. Like being cast out was a sign of something broken in the person, not something broken in the system doing the casting. At 0247, the radio crackled. Incoming trauma. Gunshot wound, thoracic, military transport, ETA 5 minutes. Sarah heard the words through the speaker at the nurse's station from across the ICU, her head lifting the way a dog's lifts at a particular frequency. Trauma changed the atmosphere of a hospital. It was like electricity in the air, a shift in pressure that everyone felt before anyone announced it. The ICU nurses moved with sudden purpose. The residents started speaking in rapid-fire exchanges. New patient. New case. New chance to prove something. The Green Beret arrived at 0315, his presence preceded by the smell of antiseptic and something else underneath, something metallic and wrong. Sarah glimpsed him through a crack in the curtains as they wheeled him into room 7, young, maybe 30, his face pale even with the sedation, his chest wrapped in combat dressings that marked him as military before anyone said a word. His left arm bore the faint scar pattern of someone who'd been through field medicine. Someone who'd felt pain she understood intimately. Dr. Ashford appeared at 0310, his presence arriving like a storm front. He reviewed the chart with the kind of focused attention he'd never once given her. His eye scanned the vitals, the post-operative notes from the military facility, the transfer paperwork marked with insignia Sarah recognized even from a distance. Then he spoke to Morrison, the charge nurse, and gestured directly toward Sarah's station. Chen doesn't go near room 7. Use the senior staff only. The words landed like a closed door. Not a suggestion. An order. Sarah felt the other nurse's eyes flick toward her, then away. She continued charting vital signs for her geriatric patients, her hand steady, her face blank. This was strategic escalation. This was Ashford showing her that he controlled not just her assignment, but her presence in her own workplace. He was isolating her further, cutting her off from any chance to prove her competence, backing her further into the corner. The monitor alarms in room 7 began at 0258. Tachycardia first. Then BP dropping. Sarah heard each alarm from 60 feet away, her head lifting with a reflexive precision that came from 8 years of trauma training, from 12 years before that of field medicine, from a lifetime of knowing what alarms meant. Residents rushed toward room 7. Their movements were fast but not practiced, their voices sharp but uncertain. She heard one of them say, his dressings compromised, and watched Dr. Ashford appear in the doorway with the clinical detachment of someone who'd never seen combat, never seen what happened when systems failed under pressure. Sarah stood in the hallway between her station and the trauma bay, frozen in the space between two versions of herself. The civilian nurse who did what she was told. The major who'd kept people alive in conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt suddenly heavy, the one marked with her call sign and the date Tikrit fell, the one she'd sworn she'd never wear again, the one she couldn't bring herself to take off even after 8 years. The code bell hadn't sounded yet. But it would. The way those monitors were escalating, the way the patient's vitals were falling, the way Ashford was moving with that particular kind of urgent calm, it was all seconds away. Sarah watched room 7 through the glass partition and made a decision that would either save her or finish the job of destroying her completely. The night shift had a particular weight to it now. Sarah moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU in scrubs that felt like a uniform nobody recognized anymore, her CNA badge clipped to her pocket where her trauma nurse credential used to hang. Change linens. Record vitals. Empty drains. Disappear. That was the rhythm Ashford had written for her, and she followed it with the precision of someone who'd followed worse orders in worse places. Room 4 needed fresh sheets. She stripped them in silence, her hands moving through the motions while 2 nurses at the station talked about weekend plans without looking at her. They'd witnessed her humiliation in that parking lot 3 days ago, had watched Ashford announce her demotion in front of the incoming team, and now the air around her table during breaks had become a carefully maintained distance. Not cruelty exactly. Just erasure. The institutional kind that was cleaner than mockery because it left no marks. The antiseptic smell of the ICU hung thick and metallic, familiar in a way that made her chest tight. She'd worked with these scents before, in field hospitals built from sand and desperation, where the smell of betadine mixed with diesel fuel and dust. She pushed the thought away and moved to room 6, then 7, avoiding the eye contact that used to mean collegiality and now meant pity or contempt. Sarah folded the corners of a hospital blanket with deliberate care, the kind of precision that turned mundane tasks into meditation. The military had taught her that repetition was survival. Do the small things perfectly. Follow the chain of command. Never volunteer. Never speak unless addressed. She'd learned these lessons at 23 in Tikrit under mortar fire, and she was learning them again at 31 in San Diego under a different kind of barrage. At 0247 hours, the ICU's careful routine fractured. The ambulance bay alert sounded, 3 short electronic chirps that meant trauma was coming hot. Sarah was in room 8, checking the 4 line of a post-op cardiac patient, when the overhead page crackled. Incoming trauma, GSW to thorax, ETA 2 minutes, ICU bed 7 standing by. Gunshot wound. The way the EMT's voice had clipped the word suggested critical, which meant room 7 was about to become the center of everything. She watched through the glass partition as the team mobilized. Dr. Ashford emerged from the physician's lounge like he'd been waiting for something to happen, his movements carrying the particular urgency of a man who enjoyed crisis. 2 residents appeared. A trauma nurse Sarah didn't recognize set up the monitor stations with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this 100 times. Nobody called for Sarah. Nobody even glanced at her direction. The stretcher came through the ER entrance moving fast, the EMT's compressions visible even from 30 feet away, the patient's chest bare and exposed. Sarah had seen that look before, the 1,000-yard stare that meant the body was shutting down by increments, that somewhere in the brainstem the organism was already calculating survival odds. The patient was green beret, she could tell immediately from the bearing even in unconsciousness, from the particular configuration of muscle, from the tactical gear still partially visible beneath the trauma shears that had cut him open. There was also something in the intake paperwork the resident carried, the way the EMT had circled certain details, the codes that weren't standard San Diego protocols. Sarah recognized those codes. She'd seen them before in Tikrit, in FOB Shank, in classified supply chains that funneled equipment through channels that didn't officially exist. The kind of medical supply routing that meant this patient wasn't a routine GSW victim. Which meant his arrival meant complications. Which meant Ashford would move fast to contain whatever this patient represented. She was right. She could see it happening in real time, the way Ashford's expression shifted, the way he pulled the resident assigned to room 7 aside and spoke 3 words she couldn't hear but could read on his lips, reassign and urgent. 15 minutes into the admission, the resident who'd been standing by suddenly found himself needed in trauma bay 2. The trauma nurse was called to assist with a post-op bleed in surgical ICU. Ashford was cleaning house, removing witnesses, creating distance between Sarah and the patient in the bed that kept drawing her eye. She felt her security badge go inactive at 0301 hours. There was no alert, no official notification. She just tried to badge into the supply closet on her next circuit and the red light held. No access. Ashford had made the call, probably to security, probably with some clinical justification about procedural compliance or facility protocols. The message was clear: you don't touch anything related to that patient. You don't go near room 7. You exist somewhere else. Sarah stood in the hallway outside the supply closet, her badge hanging uselessly from her pocket, and made herself count the breaths. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The kind of breathing you did before operations, when the world narrowed to survival and there was no room for anything except the next action. Her hands were steady. They would always be steady. That was the thing about hands that had held human hearts together while shells exploded overhead. They didn't shake over institutional betrayal. Through the glass partition of room 7, she could see the monitors starting to escalate. The patient's numbers were moving wrong, the heart rate climbing, the oxygen saturation trending downward, the kind of trajectory that meant something was destabilizing internally. The sternum incision looked tense in a way that made her want to move closer, to assess. Field medicine had taught her to read wounds the way other people read faces, to understand the language of swelling and wound integrity and sutured layers that were starting to fail. This patient's chest was talking, and nobody in that room spoke the language. She went to the break room and didn't look back. She sat in the plastic chair by the window and watched the rain start to fall across San Diego, hammering the parking lot below like applause for something that hadn't happened yet. The green beret in room 7 had maybe 8 hours before something critical failed. The way those monitors were escalating, the way the vitals were drifting, the way Ashford had orchestrated the room into isolation, it was all seconds away from a cascade she could predict like reading coordinates on a map. Sarah Chen sat in the break room at 0302 hours and made a decision that would either save the man in room 7 or finish the job of erasing her completely. There was no third option. The monitors in room 7 began their violent pitch at exactly 0303 hours, a synchronized descent that pulled every eye in the ICU toward the glass partition. The patient's chest incision split open in a single violent dehiscence, the internal sutures failing in cascade, arterial blood hitting the linoleum in pulsing arcs. The first-year resident, a kid who probably hadn't been through 50 traumas, screamed something wordless and lunged for the crash cart. His hands fumbled with sterile drapes, with gauze pads that saturated red in seconds. The blood kept coming, pooling faster than anyone could contain it, spreading across the mattress like a map of failure. The second-year resident was doing compressions against a compromised chest cavity, his hand sinking into a space that shouldn't be open, and Sarah could see from 30 feet away that the pressure was making things worse, that every compression was driving blood into the pericardium, was squeezing the heart in its own fluid. She didn't move. Not yet. She stood at the nurse's station and watched the architecture of crisis unfold with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse. Dr. Ashford appeared from the physician's lounge with his face gone pale, with the particular expression of a man who understood that something catastrophic was unfolding in his hand-picked room. He grabbed the intercom. "Where is the attending? Someone page cardiac surgery, tell them we need him in trauma now." His voice carried authority, carried the assumption that this was fixable, that enough rank and enough noise could reconstruct this patient from the blood pooling across that mattress. The second-year resident's voice cracked. "He's bleeding out, the wound is completely open, I can't, his pericardium is filling, his tamponading, we need," she was trained. You could hear it in the way she diagnosed the situation even under catastrophe. But training wasn't enough when there was no surgeon in the building and the clock was running backward. Sarah took 3 steps forward. Just 3. The motion caught Ashford's attention, and he turned toward her with his expression already hardening into refusal. "Chen, you're not authorized in here. I told you step away from that patient. I will have security remove you." But his voice was already fractional, already divided between the crisis in front of him and the insubordination at his peripheral vision. She kept walking. She pushed past him into room 7, and the world narrowed to the patient on the bed and the equations written in blood across his open chest. The sternum was compromised. The internal sutures had failed catastrophically. The heart was being strangled by its own blood filling the pericardial sac. She could see it all in 2 seconds, the way tissue tells its story to hands that know how to read. She looked at the resident, at the first year who was still reaching for supplies he didn't know how to use, at the second year who'd already understood they were losing him, and when she spoke, her voice dropped into a register she hadn't used in 8 years. Not a request. Command absolute and cold. Scalpel. 14-gauge angiocath if you have it. Betadine. Move. The first-year resident stared at her. You're a CNA, you can't. Give me the scalpel or he dies in 90 seconds. Her hand extended, steady as a surgical laser. She could feel Ashford behind her, gathering the words for authority, the justifications for removing her from the room. But the second-year resident, the one who'd understood the trajectory, placed the scalpel into Sarah's palm without hesitation. There was a moment where everything hung suspended. Then she cut. The blade went through the skin with the kind of precision that came from having done it before, in darkness, with mortar fire outside the operating tent. She opened the pericardium and the blood released like pressure, and the Green Beret's heart began to beat again under her hands before anyone could find the words to stop her. The monitor alarm shrieked at 0303 hours like a siren from hell itself. Sarah was at the medication cart 3 beds down when she heard it, that particular flat scream that meant catastrophic hemodynamic collapse. She didn't run. She walked. The kind of walk that came from having heard that sound before, in places where running drew fire. The Green Beret surgical dressing had soaked through crimson in the time it took the night shift to blink. His chest incision, the original trauma closure from his admission 3 days ago, had dehisced completely, splitting open like a mouth screaming silently. Arterial blood pooled across the bed with the terrible efficiency of a severed anterior thoracic artery. His pressure was already tanking. 70/40. Then 60/30. 2 residents stood frozen beside the bed, their hands hovering uselessly above the patient like they were afraid the blood might bite them. One of them was saying something, calling for the crash cart, calling for Ashford, calling for help that was already too late if nobody moved in the next 8 seconds. The heart monitor showed a chaotic rhythm that didn't match any textbook definition. Sinus tachycardia hadn't evolved into ventricular fibrillation yet. It was worse than that. It was a heart trying to beat while the chest cavity flooded and pressure crushed it into submission. Sarah reached for the sterile field at the bedside. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, her fingers finding the 14-gauge angiocath needle, confirming 2 units of O-negative were already hanging. Get me a scalpel. Now. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. It simply became the only sound in the room that mattered. The resident nearest to the instrument tray, a girl who looked maybe 26, snapped to attention and placed a surgical blade directly into Sarah's palm before her conscious brain caught up to her body's response. The first incision was a single clean stroke, extending the original surgical line downward through the sternum with the kind of precision that came from having done it before in darkness, with mortar fire outside the operating tent. Blood welled immediately, so much blood, but Sarah was already moving to the second incision, perpendicular, opening the chest cavity laterally. The third cut spread the incision wide, and she reached directly into the Green Beret's thorax with her right hand, her fingers finding the pericardium, feeling for the heart beneath the fluid. A third-year resident, the one standing closest, the one who'd watched residents before her, would later write a report describing what happened next. He would use the word impossible 3 times. He would note the precision of the cuts. He would swear that the woman in the blooded scrubs had performed this procedure before, probably 100 times, because nobody performs an emergency thoracotomy that clean on their first attempt. He would remember her voice more than anything else, steady as anesthesia, commanding like morphine, stop compressions. I'm going internal. Epinephrine, 1 milligram, Push it now. 2 units O negative on rapid infuser. Someone get me a proper ventilation bag, his oxygen sat is 70 and dropping. The nurses moved like she'd rehearsed this with them 1,000 times. They hadn't. The young resident who'd been frozen moments before was now pushing epinephrine through the 4 while Sarah's fingers moved inside the Green Beret's chest cavity, her hand forming a fist around his heart, compressing manually with the rhythm of someone who understood that pain was data and pressure was mercy. Counting compression silently, 1, 2, 3, 4, feeling for the flutter, the hesitation, the moment when medication met desperate tissue and something shifted. The ventilation bag wheezed as someone, it didn't matter who, squeezed oxygen into the patient's lungs. The monitor showed change, the chaotic rhythm beginning to organize itself. 82 beats per minute. 85. A rhythm that looked almost normal, almost alive, almost like a heart remembering how to work. 90 seconds. That's all it took. At 0305, the monitor showed sinus rhythm. A steady beep. A pressure reading that climbed from 68 back up to 82. Oxygen saturation rising, 75, 82, 88, finally 93. The Green Beret's heart beating again under Sarah's hands, under her fingers, under the blood and the fluorescent lights and the shocked silence of people who'd just watched something they didn't know how to process. Sarah slowly withdrew her hand from the patient's chest cavity. The surgical team stood frozen, scalpels hovering, eyes locked on her like she'd just materialized from another dimension. She didn't acknowledge their stares. She stepped back from the bed, her scrub soaked crimson, her hands covered in blood up to the wrists, and the ICU fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors and the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then boots. Heavy, multiple, rapid, echoing down the corridor like thunder approaching. 6 military police in full tactical gear appeared in the ICU entrance at 0308, their uniforms crisp, their presence altering the very air pressure in the room. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. 2 of them flanked the Green Beret's bed. 2 positioned themselves at the ICU entrance. 2 moved to seal the secondary exit with the speed that suggested this was classified protocol, not standard procedure. A colonel followed them, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, his face carved from granite, his eyes moving across the room with the calculation of someone reading a tactical situation. His presence made the fluorescent light seem dimmer. Made the blood on Sarah's hands look darker. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his mouth already forming words, already assembling the performance of authority that usually worked on everyone. Colonel, I'm the attending physician on this patient. I need to understand what's happening here, I need to. You need to step aside, doctor. The colonel's voice moved through the room like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, purposeful, completely indifferent to objection. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. He simply spoke and everything else became secondary to the fact that he had spoken. Ashford's face drained. His mouth closed. Sarah watched him understand, in that moment, that whatever he'd thought he was controlling had just slipped entirely out of his hands. That whatever the Green Beret was, whoever he was, whatever his presence meant, the situation had escalated beyond hospital administration and internal policy and the careful manipulation of supply chain fraud. The colonel looked directly at Sarah. Just for a moment. His expression didn't change. Then he turned back to his officers. Secure the patient. No one enters or leaves the ICU without my authorization. Within 60 minutes, Ashford had Sarah's security badge deactivated. Within 90, he was in his office making urgent whispered phone calls to the state medical board, his voice tight with something between fear and desperation, speaking about unauthorized procedures and dangerous overreach and impersonation of surgical authority. The last one made him sound shrill. Made him sound like a man who knew his version of events was about to lose a war against whatever the truth actually was. By 0430, he'd personally reassigned the 4 ICU nurses who'd witnessed Sarah's save. Different floors. Different shifts. Different buildings if necessary. Scattered them before they could compare notes, before they could corroborate, before their testimony could calcify into something inconvenient. He was very good at this part. The administrative erasure. The institutional silence. At 05:05, Sarah's supervisor appeared in the break room holding a manila folder that looked heavy despite being almost empty. "I'm sorry," the supervisor said, and she actually looked like she meant it. "Termination paperwork. Effective immediately. You're authorized to collect your personal items from your locker and then security will escort you from the building." Sarah read the form without expression. The reasons listed were vague: unauthorized medical procedure, misrepresentation of credentials, violation of scope of practice. Nothing that mentioned what she'd actually done. Nothing that said she'd saved a man's life when everyone else had been paralyzed by shock. She signed her name on the line provided, her handwriting steady, her hands already dried of blood. The basement laundry room smelled like detergent and industrial bleach, the kind of chemical clean that masked other things underneath. The kind of smell that meant forgetting. Sarah stood alone among the industrial washers, her bloody scrubs dripping into a collection bin, and she began to fold them with the precision of someone who'd been folding things carefully her entire life. Each edge creased exact. Each corner aligned. The methodical repetition of erasure. The dog tag swung forward on its broken chain as she bent to the task. Titanium, stamped with her callsign and the date Tikrit fell. She touched it once, just the edge of her finger against the cold metal, then tucked it back beneath her scrubs. Still hidden. Still her secret. Still the only real thing she'd kept from a life that officially never happened. She placed the folded scrubs in the return bin, stood in the basement of Oak Creek Memorial at 06:02 hours, and understood that she was being erased again. This time by a hospital system. This time by a man with a pharmaceutical empire and a pathology that required other people's destruction to feel safe. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the Green Beret was upstairs, stabilized, alive, and whatever he was, whoever he represented, was going to ask questions she wasn't authorized to answer. Questions that would lead to places where her sealed file lived. Questions that would unravel everything she'd been ordered to forget about Tikrit. She climbed the basement stairs toward the parking lot where her life was waiting to be completely dismantled, and she didn't know yet that 3 days from now, that Green Beret would wake. That he would speak her name. That a single word was going to change everything. The basement laundry room hummed with the fluorescent lights and the mechanical churn of the industrial washers, each cycle grinding like a confession that wouldn't stay buried. Sarah folded her scrubs with the same deliberate care she'd once used to feel dress wounds under mortar fire, each crease perfect, each movement precise, as if the geometry of the fold could somehow control what was falling apart. The fabric still held the copper smell of blood and the antiseptic tang of the trauma bay, and she pressed each piece flat against the stainless steel table like she was folding away the last 8 hours of her existence. The night shift was over. So was everything else. By 05:45 hours, Ashford had moved with the efficiency of a predator securing a kill. Her security badge had been deactivated before dawn. She'd swiped it at the time clock and watched the red light blink, felt the door lock against her, all while he was already 3 moves ahead. He'd called his contacts at the State Medical Board at 03:07, before she'd even finished the thoracotomy, before the military police had cordoned off the ICU. The attending physician who'd watched her save a man's life, the one who'd stood silent as her hands moved inside a human chest, the doctor got reassigned to the psychiatric unit within 40 minutes of shift end, his name on a transfer memo before he'd even clocked out. The trauma nurse who'd handed her the first scalpel, the resident who'd stood paralyzed as she barked orders in a voice that made everyone in that room remember they'd volunteered to save lives. Both reassigned. The ICU supervisor? Flagged for the staffing review. Sarah had watched it unfold like she was reading someone else's hospital chart. She understood the architecture of it perfectly. Ashford had seen her examining those pharmaceutical codes 3 weeks ago. She'd recognized the supplier designations, shell companies she'd seen before, in Tikrit, in black market networks that channeled counterfeit drugs through military supply chains. Ashford had spent 8 years building this operation right here in San Diego, right inside Oak Creek Memorial, and she'd nearly ended it with a single glance at a medication order. The Green Beret's arrival wasn't random. Ashford had made his move with surgical precision, remove the witness who could connect the dots, bury her before she understood what she'd seen, make sure every person who'd watched her succeed got scattered to different floors, different shifts, different hospitals if necessary. He'd done all of it before sunrise. By 0600 hours, her supervisor had entered the break room with a manila folder and a face that said she'd been threatened into this task. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening, but HR received an ethics complaint this morning, and Dr. Ashford's already spoken to the medical board, and they're recommending immediate suspension pending investigation." The words came out like they'd been rehearsed, like the woman delivering them had been coached on how to minimize eye contact. Sarah had taken the paperwork without speaking, hadn't argued, hadn't asked a single question. She'd simply nodded once and walked to her locker. The folder had contained formal termination language, a list of fabricated violations, improper medication handling, insubordination, unauthorized clinical procedures, all of it carefully designed to look legitimate to anyone who didn't understand what Ashford had actually engineered. He wasn't just firing her. He was erasing her. The basement laundry room was empty at shift end, just the industrial rumble of machines and the hum of fluorescence and the weight of 8 years of silence condensing into this single moment. Sarah folded the last piece of her scrubs, the one stained with the Green Beret's blood, the ones that proved she'd been here, that she'd acted, that she'd broken every protocol her government had forced her to sign, and placed them in the hospital linen bin. The dog tag beneath her shirt, the one engraved with her call sign and the date Tikrit fell, pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat she'd been suppressing. She'd been ordered to disappear 8 years ago. Now she was disappearing again. This time into a basement laundry room, folding scrubs, becoming nobody. Becoming nobody again. 3 days passed. Sarah didn't leave her apartment, didn't call anyone, didn't check her phone. The military had her number. They always did. She sat on her balcony overlooking San Diego and watched the harbor where supply ships came and went, and she thought about a field hospital in Tikrit where she'd held 43 lives together with her hands and bandages and a voice that refused to break under siege. She thought about how quietly heroism dies. How it dies in basement laundry rooms. How it dies when the bureaucracy that created you decides your existence has become a liability. But that wasn't the kind of silence that held. On the 72-hour mark, as Ashford stood in the hospital boardroom presenting his fabricated ethics complaint to the board of directors, his voice smooth as oil, his charts carefully prepared, his narrative perfectly constructed, the Green Beret opened his eyes in the ICU recovery room. His breathing tube had been removed 6 hours earlier. His chest wound had been sutured by the attending physician, the one working his second shift because the ICU was understaffed thanks to the reassignments. And when the Green Beret's vision cleared, when his eyes focused on the hospital room around him, they landed on Sarah being escorted out the door by hospital security, her badge already deactivated, her shift officially over, her existence officially erased from Oak Creek Memorial's payroll. The Green Beret struggled against the morphine and the catheter lines, his chest exploding in pain, his voice a raw rasp through damaged vocal cords. "Valkyrie," he said. Just that single word. His 8-year-old daughter, sitting in a visitor's chair in scrubs because her mother had brought her to see her father wake up, looked at him confused. "Daddy," said her name, the little girl said to the colonel standing at the bedside, the field commander who'd been riding the Green Beret since extraction. The officer went rigid. He reached for his tablet. His hands moved with the sudden precision of someone who'd just understood that a very specific piece of the world had just been placed exactly where it needed to be. The file took 90 seconds to pull up. 60 more to read. And when he looked up from that tablet, the colonel knew everything that needed to be known about the nurse being escorted out of the hospital building by security. Major Sarah Chen. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Distinguished Service Cross. The file was sealed. Encryption, 8 years of ordered silence, 8 years of a name that officially did not exist, 8 years of a woman who'd been made into a ghost. In the boardroom on the 4th floor, a trauma nurse pulled the sealed file from the patient's classified medical record and read it aloud with trembling hands. This patient was admitted under DOD jurisdiction. Medical history indicates classified operation involvement. Next of kin clearance required for all treatment discussions. She paused. There's a notation here. Attending physician at time of critical wound dehiscence, Major Sarah Chen, combat surgeon, 75th Ranger Regiment Medical Attachment, Tikrit Operation 2015. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, hear it tap against the windows like it was trying to get in. The SEAL team leader who'd arrived with the patient, the one who'd been standing in the trauma bay while a civilian nurse performed a life-saving procedure with the precision of someone who'd done it under fire, stepped forward. His dress uniform was immaculate, his insignia polished, his rank clearly visible. Major Chen held a field hospital alone for 16 hours under siege, he said, his voice steady as a compass. 43 lives. 12 of them civilians. She took 2 bullets doing it. This woman has more commendations than this entire hospital combined. He looked directly at Ashford. And she just got fired for saving a soldier's life. The CEO's face shifted. The board members' expressions changed. Someone opened their mouth to speak and then stopped. The SEAL team leader continued, the patient she saved in your ICU. Green Beret. His name was classified until 30 seconds ago when he identified her by callsign from his hospital bed. He's been hospitalized 37 times in his career and he's never woken up mid-recovery before. He woke up for her. The moment hung like a scalpel suspended above skin, ready to cut. You fired a decorated combat surgeon and classified her out of the system because a man with a criminal pharmaceutical operation wanted her disappeared. The door opened. An FBI agent stepped inside. Apparently he'd been waiting in the corridor. Apparently he'd been listening to everything. He opened his badge with the kind of casual finality that made the room understand that nothing in this boardroom was going to matter anymore compared to what happened outside of it. Dr. Marcus Ashford, we have a warrant for your records. The medications flagged in Major Chen's preliminary examination 3 weeks ago are the same ones cited in an 11-month federal investigation into pharmaceutical supply chain fraud. The audit trail leads directly to fabricated patient billing under your authorization codes. You've been under investigation since the moment Major Chen looked at that chart. Ashford's face went white. Then red. His mouth opened like he was going to argue, going to defend himself, going to claim that this was all a misunderstanding orchestrated by a nurse who misrepresented her credentials, but the trauma nurse who'd read Sarah's file spoke first. Dr. Ashford personally reassigned all 4 staff members who witnessed Major Chen's emergency procedure. He deactivated her hospital access within 1 hour. He called the state medical board before her termination paperwork was filed. He saw something he shouldn't have. Major Chen recognized his pharmaceutical codes, and he spent 3 days constructing an elaborate fabrication to disappear her before she connected those dots to his criminal operation. The CEO stood. Security, escort Dr. Ashford from the premises. His privileges are suspended pending investigation. Ashford's protests died in his throat. His mouth kept opening and closing like a fish pulled onto dry ground, like he was trying to find words that would rewind the last 72 hours, but Sarah was already looking at him with that same quiet dignity she'd maintained through every humiliation he'd orchestrated. Her expression didn't change. Her eyes didn't flicker. And in that moment, Ashford understood with visible horror that his own weapon had destroyed him. His attempt to erase her had only illuminated exactly who she was. The FBI agent stepped forward and read him his rights as he stood there in a boardroom full of people who'd just learned the truth about the man they trusted to run their hospital's medical operations. Sarah was offered her position back. She declined politely. The Green Beret, stable enough now to sit upright in his ICU bed with his chest wound carefully bandaged and monitored, asked if he could meet her privately. She went to his room. They spoke for exactly 6 minutes. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, a single gesture that carried 8 years of weight. Her hand moved to the dog tag beneath her civilian shirt. "Tikrit, 2015, she said quietly. He understood immediately. No other words were needed. Some conversations exist beyond language. The military offered to reinstate her with full honors. Sarah took 48 hours to consider. During those hours, she didn't call anyone. She stood on her balcony and watched the harbor, and she understood that the silence which had nearly destroyed her had instead preserved her, kept her sharp, kept her ready for the exact moment when the world needed to know who she actually was. She accepted the reinstatement. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.